quote, "If it is in order, I will go, but I am not going to die for the emperor or for Imperial Japan. I am going for my beloved wife. If Japan loses, she might be raped by Americans. I am dying for someone I love most, to protect her." End quote. This mirrors what you read from a lot of these pilots, although it should be noted there were thousands of them, and they run the gamut in terms of the differences in their background. And some of them do seem a little like the robotic figures who seem to have been brainwashed into just dying for the emperor and happy to do it. Some of those people fit that mold, but most of them don't. What's more, since they can't get the professionals to volunteer to do this, they go after like cadets and training pilots and students at the university. This is one of the really weird things about this program. You could see the Nazi Germany regime, for example, maybe picking up the derelicts off the street, or the people, the undesirables that they'd thrown into concentration camps, or those kinds, the discredited people, and making them the suicide pilots. The Japanese instead make a lot of these suicide pilots come from their best and their brightest. The kids at the elite colleges. Really, if you look at them and you read the accounts, they almost seem like the people that were picked on by all these macho, military types who, when they finally show up to be kamikazes, are picked on even more, treated like nerds, the Four Eyes, the brainiacs. It's interesting to read who these people were, though. And Ian W. Toll, in his book, Twilight of the Gods, has a quick rundown, and he writes, quote, "About half of the kamikaze pilots of 1945 had been drawn from the ranks of university students. Many were cosmopolitan intellectuals who had been exposed to foreign ideas and influences, including Western philosophy and literature. These traits had not endeared them to their officers and NCOs in military training camps. Many young scholars had been singled out for special abuse, including vicious beatings, leaving them with feelings of contempt and loathing for military authority and for the tyrannical regime that held the nation's fate in its grip. In diaries and letters, many of these future kamikazes identified themselves as political liberals and Democrats. Some found much to admire in the American model of society and government. Others harbored radical, utopian, pacifist, or even Marxist views." End quote. Onuki Tierney runs down the backgrounds of a lot of these people. Most of them speak multiple languages. Their reading list would shame an English professor. These are the very people you look at as the people who are going to have to rebuild Japan, right? And instead they're being thrown into the meat grinder. Reading the accounts from these people is fascinating. First of all, they all seem to be patriots even if they disagree with the government. Some of them specifically are looking forward to helping the post-war Japan emerge. A lot of them think about themselves as helping their families back home and trying to make a difference to see that they don't end up bombed or occupied. Some of the pilots expressed all sorts of worry and remorse about the way their own army were treating captive populations. This is not what you expect. I was thinking how very different this is, right? How you couldn't expect any other major military in the Second World War to do something like this. But then I was doing some research and I came across, I think it was like a letter to the editor or something like that by a person who identified themselves as a U.S. Marine. They didn't say in what era. All they had written, though, was if they had found themselves in a situation where their country was about to be occupied, where their government or their military superiors said that they could reduce the chances of that happening if they'd be willing to sacrifice their lives, flying their plane into an enemy ship, this person who identified as a U.S. Marine said he would be happy to do that. And then I thought to myself, the Japanese are just like everyone else, only more so, right? I mean, you can kind of see where all this hails from. They just took it to levels that in most societies are theoretical. The one part that really got to me the most, there were several. I mean, there was the one about the Christian pilots. You forget that there's a sizable Christian population in Japan, and you think of suicide as being prohibited by the religion, but there were Japanese kamikaze pilots who brought their Bibles into the cockpit with them, taped the photo of their mother to their chest. And when I was reading about this, one person had said, well, isn't suicide frowned upon by the church? And someone else explained that they just didn't see it as suicide. They looked at it as the war bringing death to them rather than they seeking it out. some of these other people were making very rational calculations because, as another historian pointed out, they weren't making a choice between a suicide attack that killed them and a wonderful world of rainbows and unicorns, right? That wasn't their other option. Their other option was probably dying somewhere else, maybe anonymously, your corpse left in a decaying jungle somewhere, your family never known what even happens to you, or you could die a hero. And I think I read, don't quote me on this, that the kamikaze pilots got an immediate increase in two military ranks. And if that's the case, well, now it's even a financial decision, right? You can die in a jungle somewhere and your family's at one level of poverty, or you could increase the amount of money that the state pays to, grieving families and widows for upkeep and all that sort of stuff. If you get your rank right, I mean, so you start to see actual maybe thinking going on in some of these decisions. And then one other thing that just moved me was how they were supposed to be volunteers, but many historians will use the word volunteer with quotation marks because the circumstances these 20 to 24-year-old guys were put in were such that they were forced into moral quandaries. And the only people that passed the moral quandaries and became the kamikaze pilots, in other words, the only ones that this strategy worked on, were sort of the most moral amongst them. For example, a lot of these volunteer sessions were framed in a way that you understood that if you said no, that you wouldn't volunteer, that meant that your refusal was consigning some other person to death. And a lot of these people couldn't handle that. But the part that moved me the most, because it's one of those things I wonder about. I wondered in a show we did on executions once, what goes through your mind the night before your own execution. This is similar. You wonder, okay, if you're a kamikaze pilot and you know tomorrow's go time, what's your last night like? And apparently the last nights were not spent alone. You spent it with the other people that were going to go with you. And in Onuki Tierney's book, she quotes a guy who wrote all this in a letter decades later to somebody else, whose job it was to cater to these pilots on their last night of life. And he writes what that was like. He is identified, by the way, as Kasuga Takeo, and he wrote, quote, "At the hall where their farewell parties were held, the young student officers drank cold sake the night before their flight. Some gulped the sake in one swallow. Others kept gulping down a large amount. The whole place degenerated into chaos. Some broke hanging light bulbs with their swords. Some lifted chairs to break the windows and tore white tablecloths. A mixture of military songs and curses filled the air. While some shouted in rage, others cried aloud. It was their last night of life. They thought of their parents, their faces and images, lovers' faces and their smiles, a sad farewell to their fiancés. All went through their minds like a running horse lantern. Although they were supposedly ready to sacrifice their precious youth the next morning for Imperial Japan and for the Emperor, they were torn beyond what words can express. Some putting their heads on the table, some writing their wills, some folding their hands in meditation, some leaving the hall, and some dancing in frenzy while breaking flower vases. They all took off with the rising sun headband the next morning. But this scene of utter desperation has hardly been reported. I observed it with my own eyes as I took care of their daily life." End quote. No, I don't know how